The Yellow River in China is as old as China itself. It's the birthplace of Chinese civilization, and it's the origin of their entire heritage as a people. And there's an ancient legend in China of the man who can tame the Yellow River and make it run clear. So the river is often referred to as China's sorrow because oftentimes the flooding can be unpredictable and deadly. And throughout China's history, you had flood after flood after flood kind of unpredictably coming and wiping away whole peoples. So it makes sense that a legend would develop about one man who would come eventually and control the river, tame it, make it safe and accessible to everybody who needs it. During the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong took that mantle upon himself, and he saw himself as the savior of China. So he began to build huge dams. He began to redirect the rivers. He began to build enormous irrigation ditches. And to do this, he used tens of millions of people whose lives and entire ways of life would be destroyed. As one doctor who followed Mao around quite a bit said, quote, "All of China was a stage, all the people performers in an extravaganza for Mao," end quote. What Mao didn't realize at the time, or probably more accurately chose not to realize, was that the stage was rotting away and the extravaganza was corrupt. Ultimately, one man's delusions of grandeur and the system he was able to create would result in tens of millions of unnecessary deaths in China. Last episode of the podcast, I believe that was episode 14, I gave a general overview of the Great Leap Forward as well as some of the reasons why it got started and kind of the general framework that Mao and the Chinese Communist Party was operating out of. This episode will focus more on a lot of the specifics of how exactly the whole operation worked and why exactly it was so inefficient, ineffective, and at the end of the day, unnecessary. So as I talked about last time, Mao organized the countryside of China into communes. These communes were viewed as the golden bridge to communism. Whole villages, or sometimes multiple villages, would be brought together into one place, and everything was collectivized. As Mao himself said, quote, "We can start communism with food, clothes, and housing. Collective canteens, free food, that's communism," end quote. And because everybody was together in the same area and everybody was equal, there was no need for jobs or wages or anything like that. So all of the people in a commune would be directed to either work in the fields as farmers, maybe digging irrigation ditches, or producing steel in backyard furnaces. Whatever the Chinese Communist Party and whatever Mao dictated that village do, that's what everyone was put to work doing. It did vary a little bit from place to place, from province to province, but by and large, there were two things that your commune could be put to work doing. The first one was agricultural and irrigation projects in order to feed the working class of China, and then the second one was producing steel in order to industrialize and modernize China. The irrigation projects in particular might have been just the worst of the worst as far as the Great Leap Forward. Whole villages would be essentially rounded up and forced into what was essentially slave labor, digging out these massive ditches and trying to redirect rivers that had been flowing for millennia. How effective your team was essentially was based on a completely arbitrary metric of how much earth you moved. So that was literally the metric, was how much earth were you just moving around. There's not necessarily a direct causation between how much digging you're doing and how effective your irrigation project is. So local leaders who were obsessed with putting up impressive numbers for Chairman Mao would order people into these kind of digging operations that weren't even getting any work done. Conditions were brutal. The stress on the local cadres to reach their numbers caused them to do things that they probably normally wouldn't have done. Anyone who criticized the techniques they were using was given the excuse that, quote, 3 years of hard work is worth 10,000 years of happiness, end quote. So there was always a clever justification waiting in the wings for the people who started to question why tens of thousands of people were dying in these irrigation schemes. There were times when Mao Zedong would actually show up and start digging with the peasants as kind of a show of support, but also kind of a PR propaganda move. So Mao would show up with his cronies for maybe 1 or 2 hours, do some digging, and then he would actually complain about how hard the work was, and he would go retire to his luxurious quarters. Make no mistake about it, the other peasants and the people who were forced into this work did not have the opportunity to take a break if they wanted to. Again, it didn't matter if you were old, sick, woman, man, child, elderly. You were forced into working on these irrigation schemes. Eventually, it got to the point where people were dying of starvation, they were dying of just exhaustion, and these people, instead of being given proper burials, they were actually just rolled into the very ditches they were digging. Sadly, it seemed that China was digging its own grave. And this kind of brings us to one of the big themes of Chinese history. And one of those themes is this idea of the old ways versus the new ways. So there's kind of always this battle in Chinese history of ancient traditions and ancestor worship and this type of stuff with kind of the new traditions or whatever new ideas are kind of percolating at the time. And this theme kind of gets shown when Mao kind of orders the irrigation schemes to continue through an ancient Ming emperor burial site. And many of the local peasants are, of course, upset about this, and a lot of even the top level people are upset because, you know, it's seen as something that is not appropriate and you shouldn't be messing with sacred burial grounds. But Mao Zedong was obsessed with this idea of the old ways being corrupt and out of date, while his new and improved ideas toward progress, towards a utopian vision, should be accepted at all costs. So, of course, the digging would go through this ancient burial site without a hitch. The irony of Mao criticizing ancient Chinese emperors and then turning around and using the exact same forced labor strategies that ancient emperors used all the time was, of course, lost on Mao Zedong. Ultimately, it turned out that using peasants who have no experience with engineering or architecture at any point in their lives to create some of the most massive irrigation projects in human history turned out ineffective. The pressure on the local cadres to produce that moved earth metric was huge, and this resulted in them applying that same pressure to the peasants who were actually doing the digging, and this, of course, leads to torture and beatings and people being worked to death. In addition to the horrors of the irrigation schemes, there were also the horrors of your standard agricultural farming practices. Instead of allowing peasants to continue farming the way they had for thousands of years, the Chinese Communist Party got involved and started collectivizing farms and telling people how to do their farming. So now a commune was no longer responsible for farming for their village and maybe the surrounding villages, but they were responsible for producing enough grain to provide for an entire province. In order to accomplish this and in order to satisfy the incredible numbers that the Chinese Communist Party was expecting from each commune, the party recommended that farmers use a technique called close cropping. The basic idea behind close cropping is that instead of spacing out your seeds as you're planting them so as to give each one room to grow appropriately, you plant as many seeds as you can on one farm and hope to produce the results that the Chinese Communist Party is dictating that you do produce. This was a truly terrible idea. Not only did close cropping not work as a strategy to produce more food than ever, it actually didn't even work as a strategy to produce the same amount of food that they were already producing. And the peasants and villagers knew this, and they often did protest against these kind of just completely inefficient farming practices. But take a listen to what the majority dealt with when they protested against the party. Here's one peasant explaining, quote, "Whatever the government said, we had to follow. If I said something wrong, if what I said was against the general line, then I would be labeled as a rightist. No one dared to say anything." End quote. Historian Frank Decatur provides more context when he explains what was going on in one of the villages in China during this Great Leap Forward. Quote, "Large cauldrons of gruel were set up in the fields, and nobody was allowed to leave, be they pregnant mothers who needed to feed their children, or elderly people wishing to take a rest. People had to slog throughout the night, since cadres had blocked off all exits back to the village. Those who objected to close planting were beaten by party activists. One stubborn old man who somehow failed to show enough enthusiasm was yanked by his hair and pushed face down into the ditch. Then the villagers were ordered to pull out the seedlings and start all over again." End quote. As we see there, anyone else who objected would fall into line very quickly after seeing that. At the end of the day, if you throw away all of the brutality and all of the torture and all of the beatings and all of the people who got sent to labor camps, what you have in China is a very inefficient system of agriculture right now. Hundreds of thousands of capable workers are now working on these foolish irrigation schemes that are getting nowhere. You have the farmers that actually are farming, all of a sudden are using techniques which have been proven age after age after age to be ineffective, and all of a sudden you're producing much less crops than you would normally. And because of the pressure to produce numbers that we talked about in episode 14, all of a sudden local leaders are inflating their numbers tremendously so as not to get labeled as a rightist or get labeled as someone who's not producing enough for the cause. Oftentimes local leaders would use various ways to mask some of the inefficiencies that they were having or just inflate the numbers altogether, and the Communist Party, the Central Party, wouldn't realize this until years later. With the production of food seemingly going well in the eyes of the Communist Party, they could now turn their attention to what they really wanted to do, which was industrialization, and specifically the output of steel. And steel at this time in China, for whatever reason, was kind of like the holy grail. So listen to Frank Decatur describe the importance of steel to the socialist machine. Quote, "Steel was the sacred ingredient in the alchemy of socialism. The amount of steel produced was a magic figure recited with religious fervor in socialist countries. Steel output magically distilled all the complex dimensions of human activity into a single precise figure that indicated where a country stood on the scale of evolution." End quote. Mao Zedong would rile up the whole country of China into producing this steel frenzy, and he became absolutely obsessed with producing more steel than countries like Great Britain or other countries in the West. The plan was a simple one. He was just going to have the people in these communes produce steel in what's called backyard furnaces. You can find pictures of these backyard furnaces on the internet, but basically you'll just see row after row of what looks like these small huts that were essentially just furnaces for melting down steel and other raw materials. And you had roving bands of militia who would force local villagers to work in these furnaces for day after day and night after night. What makes it even more sad is that they were forced to put their possessions into the furnace in order to produce more steel and iron. So pots and pans that were essential for making food were thrown into the furnace. Any sort of personal possessions or belongings that could be harvested from the furnace would be thrown in there. Tractors were thrown in there. Farming equipment was thrown in there. Anything that could increase the bottom line of steel production was going to be thrown into the furnace. It is sad to just think about literally millions and millions of peasants throwing their lives away and watching it all get burned away. In what is a surprise to absolutely nobody, the steel and the iron that was produced in these backyard furnaces was completely low quality and almost useless. Just like peasants and local villagers have no idea how to create dams and aqueducts or irrigation schemes, they also have no idea how to create good steel. Okay, this idea didn't dawn on the Communist Party though. Ultimately, the whole thing was a huge loss as far as money, as far as lives that were lost working, as far as the houses that were torn down to throw into the furnace, as far as the pots and the pans, the tractors, the farming equipment, anything steel that was wasted away trying to create this industrial utopia in China. It really highlights why this story is so sad, because at the end of the day, all of this industrial and economic modernization that was happening during the Great Leap Forward, that was causing so much pain and suffering for so many people, was completely unnecessary. And it really does make you upset to read about how Mao and some of these higher level guys were just ignoring a lot of the criticisms and a lot of the ideas that would make this more of a gradual process and make this, instead of trying to catch up with Great Britain in 5 years or 15 years, let's do this over the course of a couple decades, and then we'll be stronger that way. Ideas like this were not only ignored, but they were actually punished by being sent to labor camps or beaten and tortured, as we've already talked about. So it really does make you upset when you do the research for something like the Great Leap Forward. I mean, if you were trying to create the conditions for a just man-made famine that would result in millions of people starving to death, you would do everything that we've talked about them doing in the Great Leap Forward. So just to recap, we now have most of the workforce being put to work on these industrialization and irrigation schemes, most of which would be completely ineffective, like we talked about, and less than a third of the population is available to farm. The ones that are farming are not experienced farmers, and they aren't doing it as well as the people who are being sent to work in the mountains or work on these furnaces. You have to keep in mind that a lot of the farming equipment has actually been melted down, including stuff like tractors and hoes and stuff like that, in order to produce more steel output. They're also using ineffective party techniques like close cropping and deep digging that are completely ineffective and leading to less crops being able to be harvested. Add on to this the inflated stats that are a result of the just inept policies of the Communist Party as far as pitting one village against another and trying to get them to compete against each other, and having the penalty for not producing well be punishment and maybe even death. The party sees these inflated stats and they shift the labor force elsewhere. So all of this is leading to the conditions for a huge famine in China. Unfortunately, the ineptitude doesn't stop there, because China was actually making the famine worse with some of their foreign trade policies. Because Mao was obsessed with industrialization and modernizing his country, he was importing a ton of industrial materials, stuff like tractors and power generators and pumps and motors and stuff like that. Most of this stuff did come from the Soviet Union, but a little of it did come from elsewhere. And in order to pay for all of this industrial stuff, Mao wanted to export out all of the grain and all of the food that he was producing. So if you're keeping track at home, this is grain and food that China actually doesn't have for all the reasons we outlined earlier. But Mao is still willing to export food from China that could help feed starving millions in order to keep China's, quote, international reputation, end quote, healthy. Mao saw it as a huge loss of face if China was unable to pay its debts immediately and quickly, because it wasn't as if the Soviet Union or these other countries were demanding that China pay right away. They actually offered some plans that allowed them to pay back their debt over the course of years or even decades. But of course, Mao insisted that it would be a loss of face if China was unable to pay back its debts quickly and effectively. And to add insult to injury, if you can believe it, Mao was actually exporting millions of tons of grain to foreign countries all over the globe in the form of economic aid, kind of as a way to prove China was still strong and healthy. So truly, the ineptitude of the Great Leap Forward knows no limits. I mean, Mao giving away really any amount of grain or food to foreign countries as aid while millions of his own people starve to death because of policies that he created is truly sad indeed. The Great Leap Forward really began in earnest in 1958, and it really went this way for a couple of years. There were plenty of attempts by people to try and convince Mao and some of the top-level guys that this was not going well, but Mao ignored them for most of about 3 or 4 years. There was something called the Liu Shan Conference in 1961 where Mao brought a lot of people together and they were all trying to talk about the Great Leap Forward and kind of how it was impacting their provinces and their cities and their localities. And ultimately, when people criticized Mao, this just led him to get even more angry, and it just led to another round of purges, the same types of purges that we talked about in episode 14. But eventually, it just becomes impossible to deny the horrors of the Great Leap Forward. Even though the Liu Shan Conference was a failure as far as immediately getting Mao to retract some of his terrible policies, it did sort of get the ball rolling as far as people thinking about how could they approach this subject of reform without getting their head chopped off. Shortly after that conference, Liu Shaoqi, my apologies if I screw up the pronunciation too much there, but he's one of either the second or the third guy behind Mao Zedong, depending on who you ask, and he actually goes to visit his hometown village to kind of investigate if any of these claims made at the Liu Shan Conference are legit. And what he sees when he gets there absolutely horrifies him. So he goes to his hometown and he sees mass graves. He sees ragged children with no families running through the streets. He sees people literally starving to death with no food. And kind of like I said earlier, eventually, once enough people see what the Great Leap Forward did to the people of China, it really becomes impossible to deny. So here's what Liu Shaoqi says about what he saw on that trip. Quote, "In carrying out the party line, in organizing the people's communes, in organizing work for the Great Leap Forward, there have been many weaknesses and errors, even very serious weaknesses and errors. The center is the principal culprit. We leaders are all responsible. Let's not blame one department or one person alone." End quote. The people of the party were in a bit of a tricky situation here as far as who is to blame for this horrible Great Leap Forward. It's difficult to blame Mao directly because anyone who's ever criticized him before has been summarily dismissed or purged or eliminated. It's also problematic to blame Mao because he's supposed to be the great savior, the leader, the person who started the revolution in China. And he's the one who's supposed to save the people from, the legend of the Yellow River and all that stuff. So if you get rid of Mao, all of a sudden you lose some of that luster and some of that sheen that's on the Communist Party right now. So ultimately the party would spread the blame around publicly so that kind of everyone took a little bit of the blame, but there wasn't enough crushing one particular person or one particular department. But in private, they were trying to distance themselves a little bit from the radical ideas of Mao Zedong. This, of course, wouldn't work out very well and would lead to the next round of mass terror known as the Cultural Revolution. And Mao and the Communist Party could cover up the Great Leap Forward any way they wanted to. But the people of China would never forget what happened during the Great Leap Forward. If you like this episode of the podcast, or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet, and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So that being said, thanks for listening.